I never planned to do a Spider-Man marathon of video making. I guess my excitement going into No Way Home was a bit of a factor in this unplanned venture, but I decided to go back and watch through every Spider-Man movie, the live action ones. We're talking the mainstream ones. We're not talking Japanese Spider-Man or direct-to-DVD or anything like that. Obviously, Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland before No Way Home came out. Part 1 of this is going to be the Raimi, Tobey Maguire movies, Part 2, the Andrew Garfield movies, and Part 3, the Tom Holland movies, and then there probably will be a fourth No Way Home review as well. So if you enjoy this, please be sure to support the other videos. I appreciate it a lot. These do actually take a lot of work and a lot of jumping through hoops with copyright crap and editing and stuff like that, so I really appreciate your support, but let's hop right into it. I feel like my opinion on these movies has changed a lot over the years, especially going back to see them now. I think that the age I was when a lot of these movies came out affected my perception of them. I like to think that I'm a fairly more on the objective side person, but I think with some of these movies I really wasn't. And that's why I thought it would be interesting to talk about them today. So before I hop into it, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content. We're going to be going back and forth on the screen between video content from movies, video game content from Spider-Man, and pictures, because I don't want to deal with disputing a copyright claim for a month. Let's hop into it. The first one we have is obviously Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man 1. This is what really started it all, and I think that this movie is often looked upon with some rose-colored glasses because of a couple of things. One is that a lot of fans were very young when these movies came out, and they really introduced us to the superhero genre of movies. I know that that was my experience with it, and so going back into this movie, I didn't want to watch it with the perception of what the movie ushered in, but what the movie also was. Yes, it's worth mentioning, this movie is responsible for things like superhero movies as we know them today. It is responsible for a lot of young men, especially young women too, but I think this movie especially resonated with a lot of young men who were, coming of age at this time and trying to figure out who they were, and seeing a character who, reminded them of themselves, learn about responsibility and who he wanted to be. This movie has a ton of cultural impact, and that's worth addressing. But as a movie, I also do think it's really great, to be honest. I know you're probably thinking I was going to say it's overhyped. I actually don't think the first Spider-Man movie is that hyped up at all. This is one of those movies that for some reason the impact about it's talked about, but the movie itself isn't that much. Willem Dafoe completely kills it in this movie. And there were things that I noticed going back in that I never really, appreciated when I was younger. One of those things is the relationship between Peter Parker and Norman Osborn. Yes, the relationship between Peter and Harry is always talked about, but the relationship between Peter and Norman is really, really well written, in a sense where it never bashes you over the head with it. They're not in tons and tons of scenes together, but they're in enough to show this animosity growing with Harry and Peter, where Norman kind of sees a son in Peter that he never got in Harry. He sees someone who is very accomplished, who didn't fail out of multiple schools, who didn't have a lot of behavioral problems. He sees someone that in a lot of ways he wanted Harry Osborn to be, which I think really adds into the dynamics of this movie because it adds a whole new layer to the villain. This is a father figure to Peter Parker, and it's really interesting to see how that relationship develops over time and see kind of the undertones of that playing off throughout the movie, along with Norman Osborn's obviously conflicted feelings and I guess I would say loyalty to his own son Harry, and him sort of using what he does, sort of using Harry to justify his process of becoming and enacting what he wants as the Green Goblin. It's very interesting to see. I think the musical score is amazing. Danny Elfman kills it completely. It was fantastic, and I love the suit in this movie. It's not my favorite Spider-Man suit, but the webbed suit and its variations probably are up there as one of my favorites in terms of especially live action. It has so much personality, and one thing that I do think that this movie gets right that a lot of, I would say, modern superhero movies get wrong is the costume department. There's nothing per se terrible about modern superhero costume making, but I do think that the real feel of it, the fabric, being able to see that these suits were built and put together with fabric and they weren't CGI'd on and changed a bunch, things like that really did make the movie feel more real. There are problems in this movie for sure. I think it's funny that we have a dystopian future where every high school student is like 25 to 30 years old, and they are probably as old or older than some of their teachers. There is believability aspects of this movie that are kind of like, oh man, when you look back at it. But overall, I love the film. There are certainly things to critique and things to love about it. I do wish people looked more, though, at it as what it is, which is a really interesting superhero origin story, which doesn't get enough attention. Yes, I know the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man is often talked about and people dote on him and love him, and I know I do too. But I think that with this movie, it would be interesting to hear more people talk about it as a film, with some of its cinematography, its practical effects, the way that it's able to balance the characters and the storytelling and make it feel like this timeless New York, this almost perpetually stuck in the 1960s New York with modern technology. That kind of stuff is not talked about as much as Tobey Maguire good and this movie and the X-Men movies helped usher in the MCU and other stuff. I think this movie deserves more attention for what it does in terms of its practicality and its character writing. There was nobody I found super annoying. Mary Jane was written well, Peter was written well, Norman and Harry were written well, and it's got some of the most iconic lines in movies, in superhero movies that I can think of. Plus, this was back when superhero scores actually mattered, when you could remember more than just the Avengers theme song from modern movies and their music. I'm not saying those composers are bad, but there is a certain iconography. It's iconic when you hear the theme song of this movie and how it varies over time. It's just beautiful. Next up is Spider-Man 2 by Sam Raimi. I love this movie. I think I could spend 30 minutes talking about how much I love it. And you know, I know that it's a bit of a cliche, but it probably is my favorite Spider-Man live-action movie. I did rewatch the original cut of it, not 2.1, for several reasons, and one of those is that 2.1 extends a lot of scenes to an uncomfortable length that I don't find funny. Things like the elevator scene and changing up some stuff like that, I just don't see the point. It did add in some interesting fight sequences, I guess not add them in, but extend them, which I think is cool, but that's about the only thing I really care for out of 2.1. So going into 2 again, I already knew that I loved this movie. This is a movie I rewatched probably about 2 years ago as well, as coming back to it now. But I didn't remember how impactful it was to me to, I guess, notice the emotional impact of the movie on myself, and the way that it was written was very interesting this time around. For example, I think that a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds and places in their life will take things different ways. It's really interesting because, again, the coming of age aspect was a big part of the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man, but it also does play some, I guess, role in this movie as well. There is a whole lot about responsibility, and I think that this villain that they picked with Alfred Molina playing Doc Ock is probably the best villain you could pick in terms of teaching Peter responsibility. I personally love the music score again, and I think that to me, this movie, along with parts of the Amazing Spider-Man films, which we'll get to later, it really resonates with me, showing how much of a hero Peter Parker is, with or without Spider-Man. Because I think one of the most powerful parts of this movie is to see Spider-Man falling. You see him over time losing his powers, and a lot of this can be, like anything in the Sam Raimi movies, it can be dissected to a very psychological level. You can break it down to ideas about impotence or how his powers are connected directly to how he believes in himself and his mindset, the same way someone can be depressed and their body can shut down. There have been cases medically of people just dying because they had a broken heart or they refused to live or they had nothing. It's interesting to see sort of that process happen with the Maguire Spider-Man in this movie and see him going through this personal struggle of trying to become who he wants to be, but he's sort of neglecting who he needs to be. this is the movie, I will say, where Mary Jane starts to annoy me personally. But I still like the way Kirsten Dunst played her in this movie. And I think that the thing with this movie is that when you break it down in terms of their relationship, it does tell a good love story from Peter's angle, but a bit of a frustrating one from Mary Jane's. I know that there are reasons why people love this Mary Jane. I know that I'm in the minority for not liking her that much, but I really do think that as this movie went on, you sort of get a on-again, off-again thing with Mary Jane and Peter that works completely from Peter's angle, but somehow makes Mary Jane out to be kind of a jerk. Even though the movie is supposed to show it the other way around. It's supposed to kind of show how Peter comes off as a jerk for being an empty seat, missing her play, not being able to step up and, I guess, reach out and connect with her in the way she wanted to connect with him, and she's been waiting for him, right? So you understand why she's so frustrated in this movie from a writing aspect. But this movie really takes Mary Jane on a bit of an emotional roller coaster, which is frustrating to watch and makes her come off a little unsympathetic. I always get the impression watching these movies that Mary Jane cares far more about Spider-Man than she does about Peter Parker. She very much likes the thrill of who he is, and yes, of course, she likes the doughy-eyed Peter Parker, and she likes how he makes her feel, and she even says that in the first movie, but it's kind of cringy, right? I'm going to use some modern lingo here. How Mary Jane sort of strings along a fiance this entire time to get attention. Okay, I know I'm not going to break this down as a character essay about her, but things like that in this movie started to frustrate me watching it through again, where I was kind of like, can we just get back to like Alfred Molina and get back to Tobey Maguire and that aspect of this movie and seeing Peter grow? I almost feel like this movie is more enjoyable if you enjoy Mary Jane as a character that's creating, I guess, a path for Peter to grow in terms of testing what he wants, than it is if you enjoy it as a romance story, at least to me. Watching this movie, the writing is not bad at all, but when you start to break down some of these characters and see a bit of where they're going and know where it ends, there are things that will start to frustrate you, where I do sort of feel like it might have actually been better for the Spider-Man movies if Peter and Mary Jane had not worked out and something else had come along. Regardless of that, because I think I could just go into that for a whole long time and derail this entire thing, I once again love the practicality of the movie. Yes, I am a sucker for practical effects, and yes, I am a sucker for things looking real, but you really can't beat the look of like Doc Ock or Spider-Man. The way the suit looks, the web suit is improved in pretty much every way in this movie, stylistically and in terms of, I guess, aesthetically pleasing looks. I've never understood when people hate on this suit, but I'm sure people feel that same way about people overhyping the Maguire movies. I think that this movie is probably the epitome of Peter Parker in Tobey Maguire as a character. And what I mean by that is that the first movie I can buy that he's Peter Parker, but the second movie he embodies that role. The parts where he is going around with no powers, where he is trying to just become an average college student, trying to impress the girl he wants to be with and trying to lead a normal life, are very impactful because you sort of see this life of what could have been. It's almost A Wonderful Life-esque, or I guess Ghost of Christmas Future-esque from something like A Christmas Carol, because you sort of see this life that Peter wants or thinks he wants in his head. Just an average guy. He's happy enough. Yeah, he's not rich, but he's with the people he wants to be with and he's enjoying his life. But over time, it starts to take a bit of a dark turn, which I thought was really fascinating, seeing things like how he has to walk by a mugging and chooses to do nothing because he has no powers and figures, well, what can I do about it? And he's given up. Seeing things like that struggle with him, and finally when he decides to really man up and go into the burning building to save that kid, I think it's one of the most impactful scenes that a Spider-Man movie has ever presented, because you see this character stripped down to the bone. This is a deconstruction of Spider-Man in a lot of ways, and not an edgelord, boring-ass deconstruction where you're like, oh, you're just rooting a fairy tale. This is a deconstruction where it breaks Spider-Man down to who he is as a person, to seeing what he is in his heart. Yes, he can ignore bad things. Yes, he can look the other way, but he can't. He can't keep doing that. That's not who he is. And seeing a scene like this where he goes in to save this kid and risks his own life and almost dies, it's really powerful. I think that's what I walked away with the most from Spider-Man 2, is just how powerful it was. And I think that sadly, between that and the responsibility arc with Doc Ock and how Peter reaches out to Doc Ock at the end to change him and redeem him, you know, he reaches a hand out, and there's a lot of undertones here too. He sees bits of himself in Doc Ock. Doc Ock's story paralleled Peter's. Instead of choosing responsibility, Doc Ock listened to the voices in his head, and he pushed that responsibility away in a, I guess, perverted attempt to finish what he started. It becomes more about him than it does become about what's good for mankind, like he told Peter the responsibility of knowledge should be used as. I think that when you watch all these powerful moments in the movie that strike emotional chords and play off of previously written storylines and enhance the movie and tie into the first one, I think that's what makes Spider-Man 3 feel like such a letdown to a lot of people. It's almost as if the success and amazing writing of Spider-Man 2 really hurt Spider-Man 3, which we're going to talk about now. With Spider-Man 3, there is a lot to talk about, but I'm going to do my best not to drag it on as long as Spider-Man 2, because this movie can be written off very quickly as a movie that has a lot of studio interference. That does not make the problems go away, but I do believe it makes them understandable. If you know the background story to this, I'm going to cliff note it super fast. Sony wanted Venom included in this movie because of merchandising and other stuff that they wanted to see happen that they believed would make the movie more profitable in the long run. But director Sam Raimi didn't want to include the character because he said he did not understand the character. That doesn't make him stupid, hold on here in the comments. What it means is this was not a character that resonated with Sam Raimi. It's just not a character that connected with him. So what he wanted to do was something different. He wanted to focus more on Harry and other plot lines like that, and he didn't want to go into the whole Venom thing. Ironically, some of the best and worst things in this movie come from Venom being forced in by Sony. It's such a mixed bag because this movie, I know that people wanted the original symbiote suit design. I love the webbed suit design, but I think that already started out on the wrong foot with a lot of comics fans. People went into this movie and they were like, why is the symbiote just the red and blue suit, but black? I love the way that looked. I love the reflections that are shown, especially in the promotional art and posters for this movie, but I get that that's a wrong foot for a lot of comics fans to start out on. That being said, I do like the comic accuracy of the symbiote crashing on Earth and attaching onto Peter Parker, and I really enjoy this almost drug addiction storyline that's told throughout this because it is surprisingly dark for a superhero movie. Now, Peter is very obviously going through a lot. It is revealed that his uncle was not actually killed by the killer that he thought he was, but by Sandman, essentially, before he was Sandman. Now, they get into this whole thing with Flint Marko, the Sandman, and how he becomes Sandman, and then how that parallels Peter's story. Again, one of the best things I think that these movies do is play those villains off of Peter in a sympathetic light. All the way back to Norman Osborn with voices in his head, you in some ways feel bad for that guy. And you do to every villain throughout the Raimi trilogy. But with Sandman, it's especially poignant because you see that he's somebody who was trying to do something bad for the right reason and really got screwed over on accident. This really does play into Peter Parker's storyline as well, with wanting vengeance on the person who essentially took his father away from him, and seeing him struggle with that throughout the whole movie is really interesting. This movie, I will say, has the most glaringly obvious CGI in all of the Spider-Man movies to me because it was not advanced enough for its time. I know that there were CGI shots in previous Spider-Man movies, but there weren't as many. I think it sticks out as early as Harry Osborn basically launching an ambush on Peter and attacking him. It shows up that early, and it really stands out because you can just see like, oh, that's not that there's no details on that CGI. Okay, all right, well, we're going there. And that was a little distracting to me throughout the movie, but I was able to look the other way on it, knowing the film's age, knowing when it's from. It's not a huge deal. I think what is a huge deal that affects this movie in a negative way is the amount of storylines they are forced to juggle. You have Peter Parker's storyline, continuing from the first two movies, about how he essentially is finding himself in Spider-Man, and his storyline with Mary Jane. Okay, so from his perspective, you already have that one. You then have Mary Jane's storyline, where she is trying to figure out who she is outside of just being the girlfriend of Spider-Man, and also trying to define herself through the movie, through her own accomplishments and other things, which again, I will briefly say, I think they wrote Mary Jane horribly in this movie, and I think she comes off as an unlikable piece of trash. She straight up emotionally cheats on Peter Parker a minimum of once or twice in this movie with Harry Osborn, and I would say physically cheats on him as well by making out with the guy. And then you also have the fact that she, every time Peter tries to reach out an olive branch and help her, she spits in his face and tells him that he's making it about him, but then when he needs help, she's surprised when he doesn't want it from her. I think that this movie comes off to me like somebody who wanted to have their first girlfriend viewed a complicated romance. It's sort of like Twilight Gone Wrong, right? Where every character is unsympathetic and you're like, man, Peter, you're being a dick. Oh man, Mary Jane, you're being horrible here. And you're sort of just getting annoyed with everybody over the course of the movie, where you're like, the only person I understand why they're acting this way is Harry, and he's being a jerk too, but at least I get it. Throughout the movie, Mary Jane really frustrated me again. This was sort of like the point where I was like, man, you know, say what you will about The Amazing Spider-Man, but I have never heard one person say that Emma Stone did not play a great, sympathetic Gwen Stacy who added to the plotline. The only thing it feels like Mary Jane is here to be in this movie is sort of an emotional baggage for Peter, which sucks. I don't think that's how you should write a character. Even if they are just here for a love interest, I think there should be more to that person than that. And moving on to the villains, there's sort of a same issue with Eddie Brock. I have never hated Topher Grace as Eddie Brock. I know he's sort of the antithesis of what people expect from Eddie. Massive, hulking, the opposite of Spider-Man. But I liked that he was sort of a bit of a snivelly little weasel, scrawny guy, kind of an opposite of Spider-Man in that way, but similar looking to him. I liked that, but this character is straight up ramrodded into the plot of this movie for no reason. I love the black suit stuff. The symbiote stuff in this movie is great. Seeing things like the fight with Sandman where Peter loses control and he attempts to murder him. Like, he would have been fine if Sandman was dead from that. In fact, he thought he was, and even bragged about it to Aunt May. Things like that, I know, how could Spider-Man give in to vengeance? But you get to see that sort of thing throughout the movie and throughout this entire trilogy of that anger building. They even show that theme in the beginning credits where you see that the symbiote taking over the web and sort of the music ramping up during some of the more awful events that have happened in Spider-Man's life, seeing how he's sort of buried these things and now how they're all coming out, and the symbiote's sort of a vehicle for that anger. Those things are great to me, but Eddie, every scene he's in is just to mess with Peter. That's it. It's just to add another little bit of emotional baggage and annoyance to Peter's life. And he really comes off at the end as a completely wasted character. I could have seen him being incorporated the same way in this movie, and then hypothetically seen a Spider-Man 4 where Venom is the main villain, give him a better voice by far, and actually make him sympathetic by building up Eddie in this movie, and I would have loved it. But as is, the more I watch this movie, the more I feel like I gave it a pass as a kid because I loved the symbiote suit and because I love Tobey Maguire and James Franco as Harry Osborn. Those storylines are fantastic, Harry and Peter, and obviously Peter and Sandman and things like that, and the themes of forgiveness throughout this movie, and how, again, they all parallel each other. From a writing standpoint, that's incredible. But also, from a writing standpoint, you're jamming way too much into a movie. We did not need Venom in this movie at all, even if we were going to include the black suit, and having to focus on 3 villains at the same time, plus a love triangle, plus a breakup, plus everything else going on throughout the course of the movie, it comes off more like a plot of a 20-hour video game than a 2-hour movie. I will say again, the music, as always, is fantastic. The practical effects look great. There's not a lot to criticize in those departments to me, other than the CGI being too much of a push in this movie. But I still like it. I think that if I were ranking these, which I'm not, this would be pretty much, though, at the bottom now of my list of what I think are good Spider-Man movies, which I can't believe I'm saying because I still really like it. It's just, there's parts of this movie that were really painful for me to sit through where I was like, oh man, even I would have written that differently. And my writing degree is like not even in film, it's in books and literature, and I was getting frustrated. So I don't know, that's probably the easiest way that I have to compare these things, but I'll move on to The Amazing Spider-Man. While dodging the copyright overlords on YouTube and also putting in all the editing and everything with this, along with just breaking it down movie by movie, it's actually a lot more work than it seems like it would be. So I really, really appreciate you guys sticking it out to this point, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content, or if you're watching this on another website like Rumble or somewhere like that, share it however you want to. I appreciate it very, very much, and I do love reading your comments down below. I appreciate you. I will be tackling the Andrew Garfield era next of Spider-Man, followed by the Tom Holland era, and finally No Way Home itself, after I think enough people have seen it to talk about it. So, have a fantastic day, and as always everyone, stay shway.